I'm Anton, and I'm a climatalist. And chances are, you might be too. Climatalists sit at the intersection of business and nature. They want to play a key role in minimising the human-led impact on the environment, but they also understand the realities of living and working in a modern, capitalist world. In this series, I'll be proving that climatalists are already out there leading the charge to marry their own good businesses with sustainable climate principles.
Hi, my name is Erin O'Dwyer. I'm a journalist, writer, editor and story consultant. I'm also the director of Good Prose Studios, a writing and editing consultancy. We help businesses and brands to tell their stories. With me today is my good friend Anton Babkov, the usual host of this podcast, which is called The Climatalist. Anton Babkov, welcome to Climatalist.
Very, very happy to be here. It's funny to have the show on the other foot.
I first met Anton in early 2024 when he came to me for help with starting a podcast. Now he has invited me back to host the final podcast of the year. Hello, Anton.
Hello, Erin.
Okay. Now, look, I'm going to completely flip this interview on its head before we even start. In your podcasts, you ask two final questions of your guests, and I am actually going to ask you those two questions as an intro to our conversation. So who is the biggest influence on your life?
Wow, cut straight to the chase. It's interesting, and I reflect on a bunch of the people that have been on the podcast and the answers that they've given. And I'm so immensely grateful for the guests that have come on this podcast and the probably 200 or 300 people that I've spoken to in the climate community. Every one of them has been a profound influence. I could talk about Bill Gates. I could talk about Andrew Grant, the very first guest on the podcast. All of those people have had an influence. But I think if I go back to the root, and this is something I've been doing over the course of the year, my parents, mum and dad. Dad hits a little bit harder because he passed away about 3 years ago. But both of my parents, I think, have had a really profound influence on my life.
Wow. Okay, we'll come back to them. Second, what's the biggest opportunity that's been left on the table in terms of the climate space and the business opportunities?
So this is basically going to be the topic of our 2025, which is building a climate bank. But I think stepping back from that, I come from a tradition of business. So my father was an entrepreneur, even though he was a trained communist. He became an entrepreneur. Mum the same. She was a strong independent support to dad and then became a strong independent real estate agent. Business has a profound capacity to affect change. That's something that I learned as well, beyond my parents. I learned in being a commercial lawyer. I learned I love takeovers, so anything takeovers related, corporate raiders, the romance of it all. There's a profound power that corporations have to solve the climate crisis. I believe there's a gap in the way that we regulate our corporations, the way that our corporations work together or don't today. And it's fine, I think, to compete for our corporations to compete. That's competitive, that's really important. But there's a gap in terms of shared infrastructure that is missing in the competitive framework in which our companies operate today. So what is the shared infrastructure? How do we create shared infrastructure, shared data, shared utilities, shared services, a standard set of ways of doing business together in groups of companies that need to work together in useful ways? And you see this on a two-party basis, maybe a three-party basis, but it's very rare that you see multi-party relationships between companies where they're actually doing something. So you get professional associations, but the act of doing something, doing a deal, solving climate change, that infrastructure is missing. And that is the problem that we're hoping to solve with the Climate Bank.
I sometimes refer to you as an aggregator. Is that a fair description of your role within that opportunity?
So my father was a fisherman, and in the 80s, this is a very sort of proud family moment, he won an award, a Soviet award for innovation. He created a device that integrated temperature, bathymetry, and trawl data, location information to support fish finding. So it was one of the first fish finding navigation instruments, and probably the first in the Soviet Union, potentially the first globally. So you patented that invention, and the patent's gone away, but that concept of integration is really important. So the capacity to see the whole picture, pull together the things that are important, and bring that insight up to the people that need to make decisions. So Dad's role, he was in the fisheries sector. He was part of the Soviet Union's fisheries fleet in the Pacific, and his role in that fleet was as a flagman. So he oversaw the operations of the fleet, and that oversight needs the capacity to zoom out, but also the capacity to zoom in. And I think that idea of integrating different factors and bringing people together, bringing solutions together, that is the role that we see Climatalist playing in the coming years.
Mm. The first time we met, you talked to me through your origin story, which basically had my jaw on the floor for about 30 minutes. I'd love you to tell the audience some of that story. Your parents are both Russian immigrants, first to New Zealand and then to Australia. Where were your parents from in Russia?
So Dad Mum likes to joke, he's got a bit of Mongolian in him, but he was from the Moscow region, so a small town near Moscow. And Mum is her ancestry. So she was born in Nakhodka, which is a town in the far. Actually, both my parents were born in the far east of Russia, but Dad's ancestry Dad's parents are from Moscow. Mum was born in Nakhodka, which is a small town in the far east of Russia, a fisheries port, and her parents' background, interestingly, is from Belarus and Ukraine. So in the context of some of the things that are happening, it's a very, very multi location family that I come from.
Mm. They're sea people, though, aren't they? They lived close to the sea. Is that correct?
100%. So the part of Russia that I'm from is called the Primorsky Krai, which means the border of the sea. I think through the 1700s, the Russians expanded out from Europe through Siberia and into the far east of Russia, and that place near the sea is where my family heritage is. It's a really interesting region, particularly in the southern part of that, Nakhodka and Vladivostok, where my parents are, or where I was born. You get this really warm sea current, so you get beautifully warm summers, but profoundly cold winters, and a climate that's very similar to the Japanese climate.
Wow. How old were you when they moved to New Zealand?
I was six years old.
Yeah. How different would your life have been if you'd grown up in Russia?
Very different.
Can you imagine what it would have been like? Where you might be now if you were still living in Russia?
I can't imagine, to be honest. I think there's a couple of factors that play into that. One, the reason that my parents left Russia was the disorder and mayhem that descended after the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union disintegrated. My dad had been held up at gunpoint, and that was kind of the catalyst, I think, for him to decide that Russia was no longer the place that my parents were comfortable to raise a family in. So I think the safety element and the ethics element, the way that capitalism formed in Russia after the fall of the Berlin Wall is terrible, awful. Lack of ethics, outright theft, brutalism, mafia. The origin story and the chaos that you can understand how it happened. Like there was absolute chaos, and people's inclination. When there's something up for grabs, you grab it, and when there's no one in charge, you take control with what you can. So I think a lot of mistakes were made, but hindsight is 20/20. I think the capacity to grow up in the Western world, where there's a rule of law and there is a way of doing business, and we have democratic principles which which advocate for transparency and mutual respect. All of those things have shaped me, along with my, very important Soviet roots and Russian heritage. So I think the way that I think about doing business is very different to the way that I would have thought about it. My parents were a pretty high society, as much as you could be in the Soviet Union. And so I suspect that had we stayed, our path, I might be a baby oligarch at this point. Who knows? But my parents very deliberately chose to leave for safety reasons and their ethical stance on the approach that other Russian families took has been a really, really important part of my ethical framework going forward. I think so. That's the one thing. The second thing is I'm gay, and being able to be myself is hard enough in the West, let alone in Russia in the direction that it's gone. And so I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to grow up here. And I'm, very sad for my Russian counterparts and the experience that they must be going through every day.
Do you know why they chose New Zealand?
Yeah, so Dad, as I mentioned, was in the fisheries fleet that was fishing out of the Pacific. So the Soviet Union did a joint venture with New Zealand where the Russian fleet came in and was based out of various ports in New Zealand. New Zealand had a very underdeveloped fisheries industry before the Russian government came into this joint venture. And so there was a lot of, apart from the provisions and being based in the country, there was an enormous amount of exchange between the people in the fleet and the nascent New Zealand fisheries industry. And I think, Dad fell in love with the country. And so, he called it Strana Dacha. Dacha is a place where you go to grow vegetables or you go on holiday. So it's the country of the dacha. And so that I think is what pulled him to that place, despite the fact it was very small, literally on the other side of the world from where we were based. But yeah, it was a pretty strong relationship he had with the country.
And how much of your growing up was based in nature?
So before I left Russia, and I mentioned the dacha, that's a good jumping off point. We had a family plot where we grew herbs and vegetables. I remember eating strawberries and raspberries. And the idea was that the family would come together, the extended family would come together, and my mother's side, her mother had 11 brothers and sisters, so an enormous extended family, certainly on my mum's side, would come together and on the weekends, in the summertime, in the spring, work on the dacha to grow vegetables and fruit, and it wasn't just for pleasure; it was also for purpose because of the conditions in the Soviet Union. You needed that food. You relied on that food. We had pickled tomatoes and pickled gherkins and all of those things that formed part of the staple of the family. And so that was probably my first exposure to nature. And New Zealand, I've just come back recently from a team offsite in Wanaka in Central Otago. New Zealand is extraordinarily beautiful. It's like an adult theme park for natural beauty.
And was there something in your childhood, do you remember, that really turned you on to nature? You've spoken about the plot and the gardening, but once you were in New Zealand, were there bushwalks that what do they call it, tramping? Did you go tramping on the weekend or did you go fishing? Or are there any sort of pivotal moments in your memory where you connected with nature and where that memory has stayed with you?
Yeah, it's funny, Erin. I ask other guests this question and I'm always looking for something specific. But my reflection from all of the conversations that I've had and my experience in New Zealand, nature is so present in New Zealand. It's present everywhere. Of course, there were bushwalks. We had a mudslide on my school camp. So that as a force, as something that kind of exists around you, absolutely in New Zealand, it's so central. And we were close to the sea. New Zealand is an island country. So being close to the sea, being surrounded by forest, dense, rich green forest. And you don't really appreciate that until you come to a place like Australia where that's not as present. And so it's just everywhere. And I think what we as humans forget is that nature is everywhere. We are part of nature, and we don't maybe notice its presence, but we're increasingly starting to notice its absence. So I think nature is in all of us, but absolutely, I having grown up in Russia around the dacha, my nickname when I was a kid was Ukropchik, which means little dill. If that gives you an indication of how much I like to dig around in the mud.
Okay. Pause, new paragraph. Let's get back into the podcast. The name of the podcast is The Climatalist. What is a climatalist?
Great question. When we were originating the name of the podcast, I started with the idea of conflict, so this conflict of climate versus capitalism. And actually the original name for the podcast was Climate versus Capitalism. And we ran a workshop, and in that workshop we discussed, there were a bunch of interesting people in the room. We discussed this idea of conflict, and right near the end, we had some brilliant discussion over 4 or 5 hours, and right near the end, there was a discussion around what we call it, and is climate versus capitalism the right name? And my brother Alex suggested climatalism. So let's ditch the conflict and think about the combination. And so if we take, the idea of climatalism is taking the best parts of capitalism and leveraging the climate crisis and nature to create a new form of capitalism that's basically just good business, but reminding us of what good business is. So respect for nature, circularity, community benefit, all of these simple but important ideas in business that are now in the zeitgeist. There's enormous commentary from Bill Gates, from Mark Carney, from various authors that have been involved in the monetary system or in the financial system in various capacities, trying to connect values back into the way that we do business. So that's the idea of the Climatalist. It's a future business person. So I studied history at university. So capitalism, communism, Marx, the whole thing. So I genuinely believe that climatalism and this idea of, again, using the crisis of the climate to transform the way that we work and the way that we do business for the benefit of people, for the benefit of nature, for the benefit of future generations, and for our own benefit right now, that is fundamentally climatalism.
Okay. When did you decide that you wanted to start a podcast to explore this idea of climate versus capitalism, or climatalism as it became known?
It's a funny story, actually. I was at dinner with a friend of mine in Brisbane who was over from the UK, and we were ordering drinks, and I was talking about potentially entering into the climate space in this year, in the next year, this year 2024. And as we were ordering drinks, I ordered a British gin, and Josh, my friend, immediately blew up at me and he said, "What are you thinking? The transit costs of this thing is absolutely wild, and you're talking about starting a blog about climate change." And so the idea that we kind of built on the idea then, but this idea of discovering, so I'm not starting. I absolutely didn't start this year, and I'm not at the end of the year an authority in the climate space, but using the podcast as a vehicle to learn about what this space looks like and share that journey with others. Super important, I think, that capacity to document and share the journey with others. And it's been extraordinary. I mentioned at the start that there has been such an outpouring of support, and people have been so incredibly generous with their time, both on the podcast and outside of it. The climate business community, the Climatalist community, if I can coin it, is extraordinary at working together around this, this giant problem. But there, so Jen and Josh. That's
it's a great story. It's a great story, and it is moments like that, isn't it, where we all go, "Oh my goodness, this action is causing this reaction on the planet, and we need to make different choices." And they're powerful realizations.
Awareness, right? Awareness is the beginning.
At education. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. So this just slightly off topic here, but I'm just curious to hear your answer to this. Only a decade ago, radio was still the domain of large corporate broadcasters, right? Now it's easy for almost anyone to buy a mic and start a podcast. I'm curious to know your view on the democratization of the media and whether you think it's improved issues of free speech and democratization. And the reason I wanted to ask you that is because you do have those communist roots, which I know from other colleagues and clients I have who are Russian. It is in your blood. It is in your DNA. So I'm just curious to know about that. But, for you as a Western Australian lover of free speech, but also for you as someone who can see where you may have been in Russia without the ability to put a microphone in front of your face and get your message out.
A message is very powerful. So one of the things that I studied at university was revolutionary history. And you think about message in history. So Marie Antoinette, if the people have no bread, let them eat cake. That line led to the downfall of the French monarchy in 1789. Absolutely, hands down. The right message, seeded in the right way, can have enormous amplification effects. And so message is wildly important, particularly in a democratic context. And everyone uses it. The power of propaganda, the language of propaganda is an incredibly powerful thing. The West, absolutely. The West, we talk about the West in Russia. So the West absolutely uses it. The Russians use it. Everyone accuses the other side of twisting the message. But message and language is an incredibly powerful force. And conversation. So deep conversation. And the power, you mentioned radio. Podcast is such a unique format because it elevates our capacity to have deep conversations again. And it allows an interviewer to shape and to use their influence or the influence of their guests to shape the conversation in a different direction. So I think message, absolutely important. The democratization piece is interesting. I think there's a couple of elements in there. The first is as we scale, as we get bigger, as our population gets bigger, naturally we need to fall into smaller and smaller tribes. We might have superstars or super influencers, but ultimately, there is an incredibly important role through social media, through podcasting, through newsletters, for people to influence the conversation. And in a climate context, that capacity to influence change and build awareness, to your point, is really wildly important. I think the learning from my communist roots and the study that I did of those roots in doing history at university is that there's an enormous power in a shared central message, but also an enormous power in small people getting up and sharing their voice, and that's the power of the democratic process.
Absolutely. Okay, so just sort of segueing from that a little bit, you did study law at university as well, and then you went on to work in mergers and acquisitions. I have a few clients who are former M&A lawyers, would you believe it? Emphasis on the former. So I'm just curious, what was that like working in that space? And are those big law firms burn and churn environments?
I think, let's start with the end, the last question. So are those law firms burn and churn environments? Absolutely, law firms value hard work. Absolutely, when you're a junior lawyer, you should work hard. And one of the things that I've really struggled with when I left law, left the Sydney corporate environment, I worked for a blue chip here called Gilbert and Tobin. When I left that environment and moved to Brisbane, which is just a giant country town where everyone is so laid back, they're almost horizontal. That work ethic was very different. Mm-hmm. But over the course of 15 years living in Brisbane and working with a mix of country folk, it's been beaten into me. Balance has been beaten into me. I like to go fast. I like to work hard. but I also recognize the importance of balance. And I've come back to Sydney this year and I've reconnected. It's been amazing reconnecting with my former community, in the legal sector and the banking sector. They're all working unsustainably. You can see it in the way, a lot of people are overweight. There's a lot of stress coming through. There's insane hours, and even with senior people, right? So junior people, I can kind of understand. You have to do the work. You have to push through, but creating a sustainable and modeling a future sustainable practice in a legal context, wildly important. And I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing now with AI is, there's two paths that we could pursue with AI and the the simplification of work. We either work less or we work more. And my thinking is that we should use those platforms to work less.
That's so interesting.
That's the first part of the question.
Yeah.
What was the?
Asked you a double bunger, didn't I? Look, I don't think you need to answer that question. It was really just what that was like. And I suppose, what I've just heard from what you've said is that something I didn't realise about you is that, you almost have a perfect storm, don't you, in that you are the son of Russian immigrants who were dogged workers. You grew up with that work ethic. You then entered the law and learnt that work ethic. And you then, and this takes us to our next topic, which is real estate, you then entered the real estate world. And people in real estate, the dedication to work and the passion that agents have is I would equate to lawyers, right? So what I'm hearing in that is that dogged work ethic that you have, and that, that was from coming up through your childhood, through your 20s. And yeah, just totally ad hoc question, how do you strike that balance? Because I know you quite well, and I know that you are working at a pace too. And striking that balance is hard for those of us who are passionate, motivated, love what we do.
I think a lot of it is about building self-awareness, which has been a challenge for me, and taking a year out between one thing and the other has given me a lot of space to reflect. Building self-awareness around when you're at your best and when you're not. I can be manic occasionally, I can be anxious, and those things, particularly when they come out in a leadership context, can be pretty ugly. And so taking the space to build self-awareness has sort of given me the capacity to know when to slow down and speed up. Sometimes you need to slow down to give yourself a strategic view, but you can also use slowing down as a way to procrastinate from doing important things. And so learning it, it's like riding a bike, you eventually work it out. But I do want to, work is good. But I think one thing that was really profoundly, you asked what it was like being a lawyer. One thing that was really profoundly beneficial, powerful, was the capacity of a junior person to come in and receive extraordinary mentorship in a legal context. The legal profession is all about patronage and mentoring and growing people. And I had some extraordinary mentors. So I had Jim Lewis, who was an ex-lawyer that was the first real job that I got in Auckland. I had Tony Woodhouse, who was a litigator who gave me my, I worked with him on a case that he then took to the High Court in New Zealand. I had David Jones, who became chairman of the New Zealand Takeovers Panel, helped the New Zealand government write the Companies Act. I had Gary Besson at Gilbert and Tobin, who was on the Takeovers Panel, and worked with the likes of the Lowies and the Packers. These people took me. So a junior, I was only the most senior a lawyer I was a 3-year PQE, and not even that, post-qualification lawyer. But these incredibly capable senior people giving their time to junior people to train them and to learn them and to help. I think that was an extraordinary part of the profession, and something that I really lacked as an entrepreneur.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. Fascinating that that's what you've taken from those years, the joy of being a mentor and the opportunity that a mentee gets.
100%.
Real estate? Can we talk about real estate yet?
100%. Let's go real estate.
We've been speaking for how long? 15, 20 minutes, and we haven't spoken about real estate yet. How did your mum get into the real estate business?
So Mum and Dad started some wild businesses in the 90s. So within a couple of years of landing in the country, they managed to charter a giant Russian freight plane that was bringing over some kind of goods from Russia and shipping live sheep back on these planes. And then Dad had some giant joint ventures between Kiwi quota holders, American or Asian financiers, and Russian vessel holders that he did in the 90s. So Mum was Dad's partner in that and worked alongside him. She was his translator in some respects. So Dad was a big thinker, but she could really distill down the essence of what he was saying. So they worked in partnership through the 90s. But then after trying hairdressing, accounting, and being trained in journalism and engineering. So Mum was a mechanical engineer in Russia. She did large-scale vessel repairs. She became a real estate agent, and she worked initially with a company called Barfoot and Thompson, a very successful family-owned business in Auckland. So they've got 120 odd offices, 100-year-old plus family business. Really, really investing in training and investing in people. And Mum cut her teeth in real estate there. And that was, a pretty interesting time for us.
Are you a family of real estate junkies?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Okay.
Absolutely not. I think I bought my first property, I'm 39, I bought my first property a year ago. Part of that was because we weren't, we couldn't borrow being entrepreneurs, which is another bugbear I have with the banking sector in Australia. But we moved around a lot when I was younger, and so the idea of home was more where the family was, where the love was, rather than a place. And so property actually hasn't been a big part of the way that we think about things in our family. And in Russia, there is no there was no private property. And even today, property has a lot less value than it does here in the West.
How did Rex come into being?
So the family moved to Melbourne in 1999, and Mum was working at a real estate agency in the southeast of Melbourne called Stockdale and Lego. And there were a couple of directors of that office, Pat and Malcolm, and one of them, I can't remember which, had built a software product using a Mac platform called FileMaker. And that software platform helped the agents in the Stockton Lego office in Cranbourne to generate business. Mum was then headhunted by Mark Guthrie, who was a trainer at Ray White head office. Mark and a woman, I think Christy, had bought a small established real estate agency, Ray White Cranbourne, with about 3 people in it, 1 computer. And Mark went about hiring people, and Mum was the first person he hired. When she arrived at the office, she realised that this place had no software, or not software that was going to allow her to do what she wanted. And being the very direct person that she is, she immediately told Mark that it wasn't good enough. And over the course of about a year or so, my little brother, who was about 13 or 14 at the time, built a piece of software for Mum that then became the software for the business. And as the business grew, so the business got to about 40, 50 people. I think they're now across 2 locations. They're in the top 3 agencies in the Ray White network. As the business grew, the product grew with it. We tried after 2 or 3 years of that, when I was still at uni in Auckland, to commercialise, and we sort of failed. We fizzled, and we told ourselves that we would never get back into real estate software. Fast forward a few years, I left the law in around about 2008 at the height of the GFC, and decided to start a business of some sort with my brother Alex and Mum. And we kind of started thinking about the climate opportunity, because I'd actually done some advisory work in the climate space as part of my work with Gilbert and Tobin, who was spinning up a climate change practice at the time. Couldn't work it out. And unfortunately, very soon after or within that period, Kevin Rudd came in and then was rolled. And so the emissions trading scheme, one path that Australia could have gone down, it went down a very different path. And so the opportunity in climate wasn't for us at that time. And so we set about trying to survive, because we very quickly ran out of money. I'd come out with a champagne budget. We started running out of money, and started picking up professional services work. So one of the pieces of work that we picked up was for a former colleague of Mum's from that Stockdale and Lego office in Cranbourne, who was now starting a partnership with two of the brothers or the sons of the owner of the Stockdale and Lego franchise in Victoria, to start a projects division selling off the plan properties and medium density properties. And they wanted a piece of software. And so we built that software and dramatically undercharged for it. And then as soon as it was done, we were like, great, we can now charge like wounded bulls. But Damien Merchant, one of the three partners in that business, being a very wily person, managed to flip our future charging into a 50% stake in the business. Along with the two brothers. Actually, there was a different partner at the time, a man called Peter Corica, but he was swapped out by one of the two Thomas brothers. So they came in and they were our shareholders in the business, our partners in the business throughout the life of Rex until Potentia Capital, a private equity firm, came in a couple of years ago. Okay.
How quickly did you move into the CEO role of that company?
I was CEO from day one. It's interesting actually between the family. So mum was in early. Alex was mum was in early, but not immediately. Alex was in as CTO pretty early, and it wasn't. We didn't call me a CEO, at least initially. I think I just picked up the reins, and then eventually it became the CEO title. Yeah.
Did you grow into that title?
God, that's a challenge.
It's a slightly loaded question.
That's a very loaded question. Did I grow into it?
Okay, let me rephrase that. What did you do well as a CEO?
That's a great framing. As a CEO at Rex, I think my biggest strength was being able to sell the vision. So sell the big picture. I could sell to clients. I could sell new team members. Sometimes I would oversell. And overselling leads to all sorts of follow-on complications. But one of the skills that I developed, I think, through my legal training was advocacy, and so I can absolutely advocate for the business. I can advocate for the products. I can advocate for the team. Sometimes I can advocate a little too strongly, which is where the strength's overdone, and so on.
Can you paint a picture of what the relationship between your brother and you is like in the workplace? Is there any anecdote that you can tell me? Or, I have a couple of insights there myself from spending time with you, and it's just a beautiful relationship. So if there's anything you can say that speaks to that close working relationship and the supportiveness between you, I'd be interested to hear.
So I was talking to Mum at our offsite, which happened recently. So Mum's involved in the Climatalist business as well as Rex. And she told me that someone had asked her what I was like as a kid. And she said I was a handful. And I was like, I thought I was the perfect child. But one of the things that she told me was that made me a handful was that I fought with my older brother. But my little brother and I actually didn't fight, which was kind of interesting because we actually, in the context of Rex, we absolutely had some pretty spectacular battles. But I think what we do exceptionally well is we manage through that conflict, and in managing through that conflict, we arrive at a set of solutions that can be really, really, really powerful. So early days, like any brothers, we would have massive disagreements. Everyone would get emotional, walk away. It was always the other guy's fault. But I think as we spent more time, building the business together, and also learned about the impact that those conflicts have on the broader organization, we started to learn how to taper that back. We might have a battle royale. We had a chief operating officer that worked with us in my last 2 or 3 years at Rex. Gave me a really interesting analogy. She said, in the center, when you're having a fight at an exec level or in the family, it doesn't feel very big. But for the rest of the organization that's on the outside, it feels like tectonic plates moving. And so being able to manage that conflict and conflict well has definitely been something that we've needed to work on as a family and as brothers. We're getting better at it. Still not there, but we're absolutely getting better at it.
That's fascinating. I mean, there's very few family businesses now, isn't there? So are there any family businesses that you look to as role models, or you look at how they've been run and think we could learn?
I think there's actually an immense number of family businesses.
Yeah.
A lot of, particularly small business.
Yeah.
You know, and we've had a lot of commentary recently in the AFR around founder-led businesses, and founder-led, often family businesses. There's something that happens, you know, in a family dynamic where you have trust in that inner circle, and as you bring other people in, that inner circle expands. And in the right context, you have these beautiful family businesses. I remember I was in Sicily about 3 or 4 years ago visiting wineries, and we went out and saw 3 different wineries. You know, one was basically owned by what looked like a mafia family, so very beautiful, surrounded by staff, one of the most pristine environments. But you know, the family was absent, but it felt like a lovely home. Another one which had been commercialized and taken over from a family by others, and it was kind of vapid and empty. And then the third one was a second generation family winery that was so rich, and the team around it was so strong. You know, they could advocate for it. It just felt like a different lived experience. You know, the sun was shining, the uniforms were golden, you know, the wine was pouring. It was such an extraordinary thing. And when families get it right, it's a beautiful thing. But then when family conflicts tip over, or family issues come through, that can also be a really dangerous thing. You know, Tolstoy says that happy families are happy in the same way, and unhappy families are unhappy in very unique ways. And so, you know, that element of getting the family happy in the center so that the organization can be happy on the outside. Like, family values are great, but you need to make sure that that the core family family unit is operating well and in sync.
What have you brought from that business? What learnings have you brought from that business into this new business?
So many learnings, lots and lots of learnings.
Get top three?
Top 3. One, that point on self-awareness, so slowing down and knowing when to back off so that I can bring my best self to the business and to the role. That's a big learning. The second learning is a lot of Rex was around crisis management. So the business was loss-making until very recently, and the new CEO has done a great job of doing something that I wasn't able to, which is constrain costs. I was all about growth. You know, Davin, the new CEO at Rex, has done a great job of creating a sustainable business for the future. But that idea of managing through crisis, you know, when you're inflamed in a crisis and everything is at stake, everything is always going to be at stake. And that's great when you're in a crisis. But if you're constantly in a crisis, people just can't keep up with that. It's just, and we're not at our best. We're not at our most creative when we're constantly sprinting, we're constantly moving. And so that idea of not holding on so tightly, and it's very easy to say, you know, very easy to say in the abstract. And I had so many people say, oh, let go of control, Anton. Well, when your entire family is employed and you've got 80 staff across multiple geographies and a bunch of clients, you're very type A real estate agents breathing down your neck, telling you exactly what you need to do with your product, that advice can be very challenging to take. And so telling yourself not to be in crisis mode isn't necessarily helpful, but having fun with it. And I guess understanding that there is a safety net, there is a fallback. And we're very lucky in the West that we do have a safety net. And we hear all these stories around entrepreneurs that have failed, gone broke, and then gone again. I think my theory on that is that once they've done it, they know that they'll be okay. It's kind of like being caught by the net, and they know that they can do it again. Mm. So I think those two things. And the third thing is, when we say that it's a people business, every business is a people business. That's 100% true. And when a leader doesn't manage those people relationships well, everything everything, starts to fall down. And no one's perfect, no one's perfect, but getting that, working on yourself so that you can bring your best self to a work context, creating clear boundaries as a leader around what you will and won't accept. So that people management side, really, really important. At the start of the year, when we were thinking about starting this business, it took me 3 or 4 months to bring myself around to the idea that I was going to be CEO. I thought maybe I'll just be a founder and I can do all the fun stuff and then hand over to a CEO. And I remember in the workshop that you facilitated, I said I feel like a failed leader, and there's so many ways that I failed as a leader at Rex, but my reflection coming to the end of the year is that those failures, those mistakes, and unfortunately, those mistakes ended up hurting a bunch of folks, and I'm very regretful of that. And as a consequence of that regret, I take those lessons forward, and those are the things, those failures and those learnings are what I believe will make me a much better leader in the next business.
Failing forward. Okay, so let's just pause and move to the next topic then. Back again, I suppose, to the podcast. You have pretty much built this podcast from the ground up over the last 12 months. Is there anything that happened, or what's the main thing, I suppose, that happened in the last 12 months that you didn't expect? The thing that just you could not have foreseen in building this podcast?
Well, being a very overconfident founder, I thought that this would be huge immediately. And I remember I was having a conversation around this, Erin, very early on. I thought, oh my God, this is going to be the biggest thing since sliced bread. Everyone's going to listen. Well, actually, very few people listened, in particular initially. And coming to the end of the year, our audience numbers, while they are building, and they're building in a really quality way, we're still not near where I thought we would be within the first sort of 3 or 4 months. That has the benefit of failing inside, out of sight of an audience, and kind of refining your craft. It's interesting when I follow a lot of interesting people on Instagram and out in the public market, and there's a big story that people tell in about year 3 or 4, and they say, well, everyone looks to the success, but they don't want to do the work when they don't know what it's like to put stuff out into the ether and nothing happens. That's really interesting. Having said that, as I've gone about the year, and you do put stuff out in the ether, and people will look, they might not be listening to a podcast, but I think that the biggest thing that I've probably taken away from this year is having faith in the process and that it's actually working perhaps better than you realize. So sometimes the metrics that you're looking at aren't the ones that are impactful. So it's funny, I had lunch with an old law school buddy who's now a senior person at the National Australia Bank. We were talking about the Instagram stories that I was posting when, at the start of the year, we decided that I would try and build a media business in 75 days, knowing nothing about media. And I was posting every day on Instagram. And this person told me that every day he would get home from his job, and after putting the kids to bed, he would jump on Instagram and look at and watch my videos. He was raptly interested in what was going on and how all this was unfolding. He never liked anything. He never commented on anything, but he looked at it, and as a consequence, he knows virtually everything that's happened in my life so far. And a lot of my professional network, my established network, and my new network are, really broadly exposed to the work that the team and I are doing with Climatalist. And so don't underestimate the impact of the work that you're doing, and definitely don't quit too soon.
No, good advice. There must be some ratio figure, I think, for how many people have seen it or been impacted by it if 5 people like it. It's sort of a multitude, isn't it, of
the multiplier effect of those 4.
Okay, how have you chosen your guests?
To be based here at the Greenhouse Climate Tech Hub. And most of the early guests, it was just grabbing opportunistically the people that were around in the space. We've become a little bit more strategic in terms of the people that we've brought on, but actually the caliber of the guests from day one has been absolutely brilliant. absolutely fascinating, and a really wide cross-section of people across the climate landscape. So if I think about the way that I've been going about trying to work out where we build a business in the climate space, I start from a position of ignorance and then I follow my curiosity. And that's kind of what we've done as a team over the course of the year, is jump from one lily pad to the next in terms of points of curiosity. And so when I meet one guest and I find a point of interest, we do a podcast. That guest might spur on a follow-on point of interest, and we've tried to get a cross-section of folks across the sector. So, we've had David Ritter from Greenpeace on the social activism side. We've had Andrew Grant, one of the early guests, who was an early pioneer in the sustainability space. We've had Martijn Wilder, the CEO of Pollination. We've had some early stage startups. So we had Alice Kendall with Pledge for the Planet and the community work that she's done. We had Joe Taranto, who is an amazing community advocate and media persona. We've had Creel Price, the CEO of Greenhouse and Investable, who has a really profoundly interesting view on the climate landscape. So building out a cross section has probably been what's directed us this year. And as we've been building, as our awareness of the space has been building, that's started to direct traffic a little bit more in terms of the guests that we've been bringing on.
Some of the topics are really difficult terrain. For example, your most recent conversation with Andrew Walker, the CEO of Airseed, there's a lot of science and engineering in that. You can't just kind of land on the chair and ask those questions without really knowing what you're talking about. So I'm curious how you get your head around those complex issues.
I think that's paying us a compliment that maybe we don't deserve. I think the guests, a lot of them are CEOs, a lot of them are leaders. They're actually incredibly good at distilling down complex information. It's kind of the role of the CEO, right? It's to tell a story, tell a good story. If you're not telling a good story, then you're not a good CEO. So that's been really, really interesting and really powerful. I've had a really strong support from Nick Kaiser, the Climatalist Chief of Staff, and Callum Taylor, our producer, and you folks early on in the piece in helping us to work out how we research, how we write, how we ask good questions, and all of those things inform the way that we approach the questions. But also, there's a lot of assumed knowledge in some of our conversations, and so we have to be careful to make sure that we bring those conversations back. So no acronyms. We try and avoid acronyms where possible. We try and simplify language, simplify concepts in ways that people will understand more broadly. So it's interesting. We are a B2B podcast, so we talk to business leaders in the climate space, but our audience is anyone. So we want to try and make climate change sexy. In order to make climate change sexy, you can't fall in love with something that you don't understand or you don't know. And so that's what we're trying to achieve with the podcast.
Okay. What can we expect from the podcast in 2025?
A lot more partnerships. So can't talk about it yet, but there are some pretty interesting partners that we're speaking with. A little more focus. So as the business starts to bring online its focus, we will start to focus potentially through short series. We'll focus the podcast more on the specific opportunities that we're going to be pursuing and some of the partners that we're working with in the space. Probably more nuance, more storytelling. And also, one of the things that we're thinking about is potentially workshopping the build out of the business with some of the guests that we have on the podcast. So I'm hoping that, as well as climate focused folks, we also have some people in the from the broader business community or the broader community in general who might have an interesting perspective to give on the way that we're building out the climate bank.
Okay, so now talk to me a little bit about the Climatalist brand and what else you're doing with other parts of the business.
So the podcast, as I mentioned, has been a research and development exercise, and we intend to continue that. The original plan for Climatalist was to start with a media business, and I think we're kind of almost incubating that at the outset with the podcast, and we expect to see that expand, with partners and with by building out additional resource over the course of 2025. What we've also achieved as a consequence of the podcast is we've arrived at a business model. And the business model is funding the transition. So enabling businesses with the know-how, the technology, the partnerships, and the funds that they need in order to transition their business. It's really challenging being a business owner. You're constantly moving from one thing to the next. You're constantly thinking about cash flow. You might be thinking about staff and customers. Very hard to zoom out and step back. You need the space, the financial space to be able to do that. And you need the headroom, the intellectual headroom. You need someone to help you navigate the landscape. So that's what we're hoping to do with the Climate Bank. So we're starting with a couple of critical vectors. So we're thinking about first-of-a-kind technology and that first-of-a-kind decarbonisation in an industrial context. And that's something that we're pursuing in partnership with Greenhouse. We're looking at regenerative agriculture as an opportunity, and the team and I have spent the last week in Wanaka speaking with farmers, with community leaders, with local technical specialists around the regen ag space and around carbon accounting to build out the regenerative ag vector. And then finally, we're looking at a residential strata. So those vectors as the first entry points for this transition funding. Now, the interesting thing about those areas is they're very complex, they're very hard to decarbonise, and that's the space that we're really, really, really fascinated by. The marketplace and the partnerships that we're going to be able to form with the Climate Bank next year, I just couldn't be more excited about.
Exciting, yeah. Something I've loved in the podcast is hearing those little nuggets where a CEO talks about a book that he's read or someone who's inspired him or her. And I'm curious to know, what will you be reading or listening to over the summer?
Interesting question.
Think about that, and I'll ask you another one. What does a climatalist do on his summer holidays?
Well, I'm going to go see the Northern Lights and interview someone in Vienna who's pioneering an aggregated financial instrument for decarbonisation. So those two things. When I travel, I like to do things with purpose. So I like to work, and then I also like to use the time that I have, use the opportunity of being in a certain place to also experience that place. So this year is a major year of solar activity, and so the Northern Lights are an extraordinary position. I've never seen the Northern Lights, despite being from the Northern Hemisphere and from being from Russia, and so I'm really, really excited to see that style of nature. I've tried to spend a lot more time in nature this year. Being in one of the coldest places in the world and seeing the Northern Lights is just going to be extraordinary. I also, I'm looking forward to having some downtime. So a tradition that we had in the legal profession and the professional services sector is, you shut down from Christmas to mid-January or even a little bit later, because it gives you the chance to rest and respite from the immense work pressure that you're often under during the course of the year. So we carry that on to Rex, and it's something that I intend to carry on in this context. So a hard stop is really, really, really important. Yeah.
Reading list?
I carry around a bundle of books with me wherever I go, most of them in a state of being partly read, half read, almost read, never read, but optimistically read.
TBR.
But the thing that I'm really interested in reading over the break, I've got a bundle of 6 or 7 strategy related books. The thing that I'm really interested in reading is a history of Istanbul. So cities, I'm really fascinated by cities. They're platforms in some sense for some of the most amazing innovations and changes that we've experienced as a species. You think about where most of the activity happens on the ocean, it's in a reef where everyone congregates. And while we push hard on cities in a climate context, we say everyone should move out to the country. Well, that's never going to happen. But I'm really curious to understand the history of Istanbul. It's a part of the world that I don't know a lot about. That's the historical shift from Roman rule to Christian rule to Islamic rule, the secularization of Turkey and where it's going now, and the role of that city in in shaping history, I think is just fascinating. So that's what I'm reading over the break.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And part of your vision is very much about Climatalist being a global brand, isn't it? So reading and learning more about those cities, is also a part of feeding your mind and your strategic thinking.
100%. 100%. So Russia as a country is very big and also shares a border with, an enormous number of other countries. So it's European, it's Eastern. Within the country, whatever you say about the politics, there is enormous diversity of different heritages that sort of come together. And what the country has done, sort of really interestingly, in a way that's different to, say, the US or other Western democracies, is they've managed to maintain diversity and those individual ethnic groups while bringing them together under a shared national identity. And so I'm really interested in that. I think that capacity to be comfortable with difference. Russia has a very large Muslim population. It also has a very large, comparatively, a very large Orthodox population. And for the most part, if you sort of exclude the Chechnya example, which is, I think, more political than religious, those religious groups have coexisted peacefully for a long, long time in that country. And so I think there's some really interesting lessons to learn from that experience. And absolutely, climate change is a global problem. It's the first truly global challenge. And one of the things, it's no mistake that we do best in innovation when we're at war. Most of the major progress that humanity has made hasn't been in peacetime; it's been in wartime. And in some sense, I don't love the concept of at war with the climate or at war with climate change. Climate change is happening whether we like it or not, but it's definitely the biggest challenge that humanity's faced collectively. And so it will take all of us acting in all of our different contexts as individuals to shift the way that we need to in order to rise to the challenge.
That is a wrap, Anton. Thank you very much for your time. Absolute pleasure to sit down with you, and I wish you all the best for the next season in 2025.
Thank you, Erin.
And that was the last Climatalist episode of the season. Thanks so much for following our journey, and a giant thank you to our guests who have taught us an incredible amount about the profitability and innovation that sits within the climate space. 2025 is shaping up to be an even bigger year for the Climatalist team, and we can't wait to show you what we've got lined up. So make sure to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next year for season 2.